You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman.
Democracy's under attack. What do we do? Stand up, fight back. When immigrant rights are under attack, what do we do? Stand up, fight back. When women's rights are under attack, what do we do? Stand up, fight back.
Hundreds of thousands of Americans across the country gathered over the weekend in support of No King's Day, a nationwide protest against the Trump administration. Marches were planned to contrast with a military parade at the nation's capital, commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Army. The events also coincided with President Trump's birthday. And it all came after a week of escalating tensions between the federal government and California officials, where immigration raids had prompted clashes between protesters and police. And Trump had called in the military against the wishes of the state's governor. Across Washington on Saturday, cities from Olympia to Wenatchee, even passengers on a ferry from Bainbridge Island had No Kings protests. And we wanted to get a sense of what the protests felt like across the state today and how the momentum of crowd participation could spark further action. In a couple minutes, we're going to get a perspective from Tukwila and from Spokane, where some demonstrators had previously clashed with immigration agents and law enforcement. First, let's look at what happened in Seattle, where an estimated 70,000 protesters marched from Cal Anderson Park to Seattle Center. KUOW reporter Casey Martin covered the demonstrations here. Hi, Casey. Thanks for being on the show.
Hey, Libby. Thanks for having me.
So going into the weekend, Casey, I felt that there was this sense in Seattle and in our state overall about bracing for potential trouble. You know, there had been skirmishes between police and protesters outside the federal building downtown. Can you first describe kind of the mood going into Saturday's demonstrations?
Yeah, a lot of pent-up energy, a lot of frustration with the President Trump's immigration crackdown. And in Seattle, there's been protests at the federal building in downtown Seattle really since Monday. There was kind of a larger one on Wednesday night. But people have been showing up during the day and then going into the night, really kind of fired up. And it's really felt after months since President Trump's reelection, there's been a feeling of, well, where's the next big protest like we saw at 2017's Women's March? And Saturday kind of felt like that culmination. And it's really been, I think the tipping point was seeing a lot of the ICE raids we saw in LA and a lot of fear of federal immigration enforcement.
Yeah, and, you know, there was this mood also the morning of, because in Minnesota you had seen these terrible political assassinations, what it seems to be political assassinations, and conversation about safety at these events.
Yeah.
So kind of overall, like this feeling of apprehension throughout the city. So all the buildup happening leading up to this, Casey, how did the actual No Kings March unfold here on Saturday?
Yeah, as you said, this was part of a nationwide protest. We saw protests in dozens of cities, large cities, and really small communities. Here locally, there was a whole bunch of nonprofit groups, advocacy groups like Seattle Indivisible, Planned Parenthood was a big sponsor, One America. And again, this came after a week of protests. And so it was almost feeling like leading up before Saturday. People were really aware. People knew that this was happening. And the turnout really spoke for itself. There were tens of thousands of people packed into Cal Anderson, walking through the streets. So the message was spread far and wide, really.
Yeah, I observed part of the march because, frankly, I felt like there could be something that went down. And I thought, you know, at some point I'm going to have to flip into reporter mode, depending on, I mean, that's a terrible thing to have to think about. But, you know, I showed up thinking there could be some kind of event that needed extra coverage. But the Capitol Hill crowd, it was very diverse. It was festive. It kind of had a party atmosphere in parts. It had people singing, clapping, drums. There were suburban folks who drove in for the day. There were younger people. What kind of messages did you hear, Casey, when you talked to people about why they showed up?
Yeah, a lot of the focus during these protests during the week have been focused on ICE and immigration enforcement. And really, the Saturday protest was kind of all over the place with people advocating pro-democracy messages. There was a lot of messages for promoting trans rights youth. Federal agency overhaul that we've seen a lot of firings at the beginning of the Trump administration. And so there was really this feeling that there's been an overreach by the White House, and people feel like there should be more limitations, or maybe there should be more pushback from Congress and local elected officials. And so you saw banners and messages really all over the place of responding to a lot of the policies by the Trump administration, not just immigration.
Yeah, the federal building downtown, we mentioned it already. You had this massive 70,000 people. They said it stretched a mile and a half, the march at one point from Capitol Hill to Seattle Center. So you have this image, and then, all eyes kind of later in the day shift to the federal building downtown because that has been the scene of more aggressive protest action and then also law enforcement responding to that. Last week, some demonstrators zip-tied some Lime bikes together to block an exit used by ICE. Can you give us a sense, is that still going on? Did that go down over the weekend as well?
Yeah, late Saturday night, there was a group of maybe a dozen, 24 people who did go to the federal building, and they're kind of occupying this space around 2nd and Marion. And for the most part, police just kind of monitor from a few blocks away. I did see social media videos of some fireworks that did go off, but this is a very small crowd compared to, tens of thousands of people who were marching through Seattle earlier that day. But people are very impassioned to kind of bring the focus there. That is where the federal immigration court is. That is, what they see as the symbol of Trump's overreach and abuse of executive powers. So people will continue to show up there. There's a lot of graffiti on the outside of the building, and I don't think that'll be going away anytime soon.
Yeah, again, 70,000 people versus maybe a couple of hundred who end up at the federal building. But the images of, things when they get lit on fire or, there's more intense activity, that always draws a lot of cameras, that draws a lot of social media posts. And that's got to be kind of frustrating for the No Kings organizers, too, when they see, we had this gigantic, totally peaceful showing, and yet later in the night, some images draw attention away. Okay, Casey Martin with KUOW, hang on, because you're going to stick around with us as we take a tour around the rest of the state to some scenes from Saturday and the immigration rallies and protests that occurred in other parts of Washington. At the same time that tens of thousands of people in Seattle were marching in the streets with that No Kings message, in Tukwila, an ICE special response team and local police used crowd control methods like tear gas on a group of about 150 people. This was not part of a No Kings protest. Instead, individuals had shown up after hearing about unusual activity at the Department of Homeland Security field office in Tukwila. At least hundreds of immigrants locally had received text messages from ICE on Friday telling them to come to the building that weekend, which raised concerns because typically the DHS field office is closed on Saturdays and Sundays. Now, the crowd that gathered outside was a mix of activists and attorneys, and that included Seattle University Assistant Professor of Law Pilar Margarita Hernandez Escontrias, and she joins me now. Pilar, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Libby. It's an honor to be present with you today here.
And why were you at the Tukwila DHS office on Saturday? What had you heard?
So, as a Latina for generations, the legal apparatus of this country has sanctioned and legitimated policies that terrorize members of my community. And so for all that time, I just think it's important for us to note that communities have been mobilizing support. They have been engaging in mutual aid and care for those who are detained. And we've been fighting for an end to the deportation regime that continues to separate us. So when I received notification from, in fact, it was one of my former law students who tapped me into a group chat notifying people about these notices that folks received, we immediately and very last minute, right, all engaged in a call to action. It was a completely autonomous group of folks who just showed up to provide what they could. We were primarily concerned, in all honesty, about the unusual nature of these check-ins. They were done very last minute. They were during the Father's Day weekend. And so many of us, I believe, were rightfully concerned that these check-ins were devised to kidnap and disappear migrants during a weekend where many people would likely not be able to respond. As you noted, nearly 70,000 people were in Seattle in a very coordinated protest, right? So in response to that, on Friday evening, many of us were collectively acting and responding to various group messages, thinking through, how might we be able to offer food to volunteers, water, snacks, financial assistance in the event that anybody should be detained, and legal aid assistance as well in the forms of Know Your Rights materials. So I think what really activated folks is a recognition that we are all in community with the individuals who would potentially be harmed when they showed up to Tukwila during this Father's Day weekend. So we had volunteers present as well to provide know your rights materials, to gather information and document time of entry of every migrant, every person who was called to check in.
And these were people who were part of what's called the Intensive Supervision Appearance Program, who got the text messages. So these are people who are not detained, but they are subject to some kind of immigration proceedings. And so these are folks who may be, wary that any kind of contact from ICE would mean that they would then later be put into a detention and moved towards deportation. Was that the fear, that people would basically go into the building and not come out?
That's absolutely the fear. And in fact, that's a well-grounded fear based on data. Last week, the very same thing occurred in Chicago, but it was so last minute. And I believe, if I'm not incorrect, that was sent through text messages. This message was sent through an app that the federal government utilizes to connect with migrants. So there was no sense that this was a sort of fake, announcement. So we did have data that suggested that people who came into these last minute check-ins were effectively detained, because 100% of those people who showed up in Chicago to their check-ins were disappeared.
The Seattle Times reports that the crowd control tactics started after some protesters blocked exits from the building. They used some no parking signs. At about 3 p.m., Tukwila police in riot gear showed up and ordered people to leave. And the Times says that Tukwila police used tear gas. ICE special response teams used other crowd control projectiles. Eventually, the exit was cleared and 6 vehicles did leave the property. Were you there for this? Did you observe this? I mean, what was your impression of how this went down?
I did observe this. I was present from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. on both Saturday and Sunday. So by 12:30 p.m. on Saturday, the field office had been closed. So between the hours of 12:30 p.m. and 3 p.m., we were in fact helping individuals who arrived for their check-in because they had received no information, no notification that the location was closed, right? So we advised everybody who was arriving for the check-in to take a photo of themselves in front of the DHS sign and upload it onto the app to demonstrate their good faith attempt to comport with the requirements. And so this had been going on for several hours. We were eating, everything was very calm, although we did have, because we were filling out these intake forms, we knew that we had actual knowledge that 2 individuals had been detained inside of that location. They had not come out after having come in. So when at around 3 o'clock, the Tukwila Police Department arrived, I believe there were about 5 vehicles. The Tukwila Police Department notified us that we were on private property and that the property owners requested assistance to allow vehicles to exit. Within, I would say, a minute or 2 minutes of that order, Tukwila PD, 20 or so officers exited their vehicles and began walking toward all of us, because there were people who were just offering legal advice who, upon viewing a mass group of law enforcement parked perpendicular, right? They were actually just parked on the road and did not close down the road. It was a very dangerous context. So upon viewing the Tukwila PD vehicles, we all walked towards it to record what was going on. And within 2 minutes, we were being effectively poisoned with toxic gas, blast balls, flash grenades, in addition to the type of rubber bullet that released tear gas. So this was deployed not just against those individuals who the Tukwila Police Department alleges they were attempting to disperse, but as well against community organizers and individuals who were simply notifying non-citizens that the facility had closed. We were in fact doing the work that DHS should have done, and effectively communicating with those individuals who had to be there for a required check-in.
Basically trying to help translate what was happening and make sure that they were on the right side of the requirements that had been put out by immigration enforcement officials. Just because we only have about a minute left here, Pilar, I want to double check with you. These are actions that the protesters took that impeded in some ways what immigration enforcement would say was their legal duties to carry out the goals of ICE, of DHS. And therefore, they needed cops to come in order to allow them to do their job. I mean, what's your response to people who say, if you show up and you're going to impede the operations of a federal law enforcement, that this is what is expected, that there will be a crowd control component to this? I mean, what's your response to that?
My response is that we live in the state of Washington, where we have something called the Keep Washington Working Act that explicitly does not allow local law enforcement to collude with federal law enforcement to carry out the federal immigration authorities' actions, right? So my response is that if in fact there were to be dispersal orders effectuated against those of us who were present on federal property, the only individuals who could provide that would be individuals and law enforcement agencies who have federal jurisdiction. So we have a statute that does not allow law enforcement to collude in the ways that we experienced on the ground on Saturday. And because law enforcement Tukwila PD was explicitly stating that their goal was to allow the vehicles to exit the compound, right? I mean, I experienced that as total cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE.
And Professor, what's next for these two people who were detained? Do we know where they're at and what's next in their case?
We do. Organizers on the ground have been communicating with the families of both of the individuals who were detained, and we are working to ensure that they have competent legal assistance and that they have all of the community needs that can offer support during this very challenging time.
We'll be reaching out to Tukwila Police as well to ask questions about what you mentioned here and their compliance with Keep Washington Working Act. I really appreciate your time today. Seattle University Assistant Professor of Law, Pilar Margarita Hernandez Escontrias. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Libby, for telling these critical stories about our community.
You're listening to Sound Aside. I'm Libby Denkman, and we're taking a tour around the state right now for a view of how protests against President Trump's immigration crackdown are playing out in different parts of Washington. Turning from Tukwila now to Spokane, where on Saturday more than 10,000 people marched from Riverfront Park through downtown to mark No King's Day. The largely peaceful protest ended later in the night with police using smoke bombs on a small crowd of marchers and arresting a handful of people who refused to disperse. This came days after a heated demonstration outside an ICE facility led to more than 30 arrests, as demonstrators tried to block the transport of two asylum seekers who were detained at a scheduled ICE check-in. Ben Stuckert is a former city council president in Spokane. He organized the protest last Wednesday and was later arrested for trying to block that ICE van. Ben, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you for doing the reporting you do. It's necessary in these times.
So I want to get to that arrest and the Wednesday operation in just a minute, but I know you attended part of the day on No King's Day on Saturday in Spokane. Can you give me a sense of the mood in your city right now? I mean, you have thousands of people coming out for No Kings, but then you also have these more heated interactions with law enforcement, some arrests at the anti-ICE demonstrations. What is the feeling in the city today, Ben?
You know, on No King's Day on Saturday, my wife and I rode the bus down to the Pride Parade, the Pride Rally, and then the Pride Rally went straight into No Kings. Our bus was full of people that were joyous. But as I walk around Pride, I think everybody's really mad at law enforcement on how they're handling things. Peaceful protests that are peaceful and nonviolent and very disciplined are ending with confrontations between local law enforcement officers, LEOs, and I think there's some discouragement, but I think as a whole, I think everybody's there's never been a protest with 10,000 people in Spokane, and I'm 53 years old and I've lived here my entire life, and I've seen a lot of people angry about a lot of things, but And the thing here in Spokane with these two gentlemen on Wednesday was that, it's a ex-Republican county commissioner and an ex-liberal progressive Democrat city council president that are both close with these young gentlemen. So this isn't even about Republicans and Democrats. This is about inhumane policies versus our common humanity.
So you put the call out on Facebook for people to show up to this protest on Wednesday, and the two men who were detained here, this is Cesar and Josuar, they are young men, one from Venezuela, one from Colombia. You had become Cesar's legal guardian 3 weeks earlier, and you mentioned that there is a Republican county commissioner who also became close with these young men. So what happened to them, and what prompted the demonstration that you helped organize?
Yeah, they're actually both from Venezuela, but they met in Colombia. That was a translation issue. I don't speak very good Spanish. They don't speak very good English, so we've had a real learning experience.
Got it.
But I am Cesar's vulnerable youth guardianship. But they came here legally under humanitarian parole, so they've done everything right. And then they applied for asylum on time and have asylum dates. And then I was also appointed under the Vulnerable Youth Guardianship Program to be Cesar's guardian. They went in for a routine checkup on Wednesday, and I accompanied them along with letters from their lawyers for each of them. I'm the young man's legal guardian, and I wasn't allowed to attend the meeting. ICE just came back out and said, hey, we're detaining them and sending them to Tacoma. And we went, myself and some others from a organization, Latinos in Spokane, which does advocacy for our Latino community. Their case manager was with us, Amy, and we went and sat in the parking lot, and the choice, I guess, was, what do we do? I could go home, but the legal system isn't working because they're here legally under humanitarian parole. They've legally applied for asylum. They have an asylum date. Or do you try to stop the machine? And I chose to put out a call on Facebook for my friends to join me because I didn't want my friends to leave, and they wouldn't even let me say goodbye to them. And so I sat there in front of the bus, and we were joined by hundreds of people because people care. And this is inhumane what's going on. And it was just an outpouring of support. And all day long, there were folks that have been very organized from our community that have been trained in nonviolence that showed up to help, and mutual aid showed up with water and food for everybody. And the constant conversation for 7 hours was to stay nonviolent, and everything stayed nonviolent until the police came, ignored de-escalation tactics. They didn't send the de-escalation tactics that the mayor and the police chief promised me. They just rolled up and started pushing on people. And of course things escalate when there's no use of de-escalation tactics. Of course things escalate when you start pushing and using physical force against people who are nonviolent. It was just mishandled all the way around. And if our local law enforcement or our local governments, they seem to want to be opposing in language these overreaches by our federal government, but they are making it worse in our communities.
Just to take the other side here, Ben, if there are federal law enforcement conducting operations and there are people blocking them from doing so, isn't it fair to arrest those people?
I guess I would say it's the police officers that blocked off the streets in Spokane. We were on the sidewalks the entire time. And, one guy sitting in front of a bus can't stop a bus. They brought in and arrested folks. It's a choice by local law enforcement. They came in, and when they came in, they specifically created a cordon to allow ICE to move those individuals from the building into a van. That local law enforcement brought the van. Those are direct violations of the Keep Washington Working Act. They aided and abetted the illegal detainment and removal of individuals in our community. They arrested me for a misdemeanor for failure to disperse, and that was my choice. But they also have a choice not to do that. We all act of our own free will,
Yeah.
And they chose to aid and abet the illegal detainment of individuals that are part of our community that are working full time.
As somebody who was formerly within the political system, I mean, former council president in Spokane, how does what's happened here to these young men, Cesar and Joshua, and your participation in this demonstration that eventually became an arrest for you, how does that shape your perspective on politics and what's going on right now in this moment?
Oh, I think it radicalizes you completely. I think that, I spent 8 years in city government as a council president trying to change things from within. And I think at a certain point when the system is not working, the system is not just not working, it's actively violating its own rules and principles, and it's inhumane, and it's not just. I think you need to put yourself between it and the machine. I view that this machine is out of control. It's a hammer, always wants to look for a nail.
So right now, what happens next? Have you heard from Cesar and Joshua? Do you know where they are and what happens next in their case?
Yes, the lawyer was able to meet with them on Friday. Shelley O'Quinn, our former Republican county commissioner, was able to meet with them Friday night. She said it was the hardest thing she's ever had to do. I got a recorded message that they recorded for the lawyer recorded for me. Their case manager from Latinos in Spokane was able to speak to them on Saturday in person. She drove over, and they called on Sunday night. And they have actually seen the news, that they're on the news and are aware. And ICE is telling them that their poor treatment and inhumane treatment is because of the attention on their case. But we don't believe so. They found these are just great young gentlemen that are doing everything right. And they've actually found 2 people in the Tacoma Detention Center that didn't have phone numbers to contact the outside. And we've been able to locate family members so they can talk to them. So even inside in inhumane conditions and being as scared and as sad as they are, they're just being the greatest human beings you could possibly be. And it's amazing.
Ben Stuckert is a former city council president in Spokane. On Wednesday, he organized a protest against the detainment of 2 young men by immigration officials. He was later arrested. And Ben, thank you very much for sharing your story.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
You're listening to Soundside on KUOW. Turning back now finally to KUOW's Casey Martin, who has been here helping us understand what's going on in our state. Again, he was covering the No Kings protest on Saturday that pulled 70,000 people into the streets to demonstrate against the Trump administration here in Seattle. And Casey, I can't help but think about how people who are reading or watching coverage of what's going on with the protests right now, they're going to see vastly different takes on how things are unfolding. I mean, can you just put on your media critic hat and talk about the split screen aspect of our current moment when we hear about activists being arrested, the crowd control tactics by police in some cases, but then also the much larger numbers of peaceful protesters in different parts of our state that came out over the weekend? I mean, what do you make about this?
Yeah, there's a lot of frustration amongst a lot of protesters that, what they see and experience on the street is not always portrayed in the media. They're not always seeing everything that's going on. And often, when you do see, police dispersal tactics like tear gas and flashbang grenades, those will make the evening news. Those will be on the front of newspapers, and not so much maybe a very peaceful, maybe even quiet march walking through the streets. And a lot of people would like to get that message out. A lot of people would like to see that there is so many people coming around and unifying, especially as we saw a lot of different groups at Saturday's march. They'd like to see a little bit more of that.
Yeah, and I think that this follows the pattern that we often see, which is generally during the day you have the larger peaceful protests, and then later at night things can devolve when there are, dozens or hundreds of people who refuse to disperse. What do you think is next in this story, Casey? I know it's a big question, but we have seen when it comes to immigration enforcement, President Trump encouraging a dial back of enforcement priorities. He said no more raids on farms, hotels, and restaurants. Now, we had activists say that even after that word went out late last week that there were still some raids and farms, especially in different parts of the country. There seems to be no indication that other businesses will see a slowing in ICE raid, whether that's construction sites, car washes, wherever. And people showing up to routine check-ins are still being detained. What do you think is next here for this story and where especially the mood of our region goes?
Yeah, as we were talking about earlier, this really felt like a tipping point after months of frustration. There have been regular protests on Saturdays, right, on probably your neighborhood street corner. And this really felt, especially after ICE raids in LA and a lot of the police response to those protests, a lot of people said they will continue showing up to the federal building. And, people are frustrated when they do see the images at night of people burning dumpsters on fire. On Wednesday night, a lot of people left when the dumpster was set on fire. Like, they knew they didn't want to be around when the cops showed up, and they didn't want to have their message devolve into a message of violence. And people said they'll keep showing up to the Federal Immigration Court, and they want to put the focus, there on federal law enforcement.
That's KUOW's Casey Martin. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
By the way, we got an email from a listener challenging us on hundreds of thousands marching in cities across the country. CBS News says organizers put that number in the millions for people who showed up on Saturday. And Tukwila Police released a statement about Saturday's actions on Facebook. That statement said in part officers were requested to assist the Federal Protective Services Police after they became barricaded in the Tukwila DHS facility by a large group of individuals blocking the drive to their facility. They go on later to say that the department would like to reiterate that our officers do not participate in immigration enforcement or otherwise assist in questioning or detaining individuals based on their immigration status or nationality in accordance with our policy and Washington state law, basically saying they were there to clear the sidewalk, not there to enforce immigration law. Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.